There exists a photograph. It was taken in 1937. Somewhere deep in rural Appalachia. A young woman holds a newborn child, her eyes hollow. Behind her, in the doorway of a rotting cabin, stands a man. His face is blurred, not by the camera, but deliberately, scratched out with something sharp. For decades, the identity of the father remained a mystery. The birth certificate was blank. The mother never spoke his name. Not to the nurses, not to the sheriff, not even on her deathbed 60 years later. But in the early 2000s, when genetic researchers began unraveling the bloodlines of isolated American families, they discovered something. Something that made the silence make sense. The child's DNA told a story more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. It revealed a family tree that didn't branch. It spiraled inward, collapsing on itself across generations. And at the center of it all was a secret so grotesque, so tightly held, that entire communities had built their silence around it. Hello everyone. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is American history, deliberately erased. And what you're about to hear isn't just about one family. It's about what happens when isolation, shame, and power converge in the darkest corners of a nation that pretends its past is clean. That baby in the photograph grew up never knowing her father. But the DNA didn't lie. It told a story written in blood across generations, in a place where the law didn't reach and morality had long since withered. And once you hear it, you'll understand. You'll understand why no one spoke his name. The valley had no official name on any map. Locals called it different things. Cutter Hollow, sometimes just the back, as if naming it properly would make it too real. Wedged between two mountain ridges in eastern Kentucky, it sat, accessible only by a single dirt road that washed out every spring. By the 1930s, fewer than 200 people lived there, scattered across rotting homesteads and cabins that leaned like broken teeth against the hillsides. There was no electricity, no running water, no school after 4th grade. The nearest town was 18 miles away, but it might as well have been another country. People who lived in the valley stayed in the valley, and people from outside knew better than to go in. The families there had names that echoed through generations. Whitaker, Fugate, Ritchie, Colley. But if you traced those names backward through birth records and crumbling church registries, something strange would begin to emerge. The branches of different family trees didn't just touch, they fused. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. In some cases, the genealogical lines looped back on themselves so tightly that researchers would later struggle to chart them, the lines crossing a dozen times on a single page. This wasn't accident. This wasn't ignorance. This was generations of deliberate isolation, enforced by geography, poverty, and something darker. A belief that outsiders carried corruption, that blood had to stay pure, that the valley was its own world with its own rules. By the time the photograph was taken in 1937, the genetic consequences were already visible. There were children born with misshapen skulls. Adults with cognitive impairments so severe they couldn't speak. Families where every member had the same vacant stare, the same sloping forehead, the same shuffle in their walk. The local doctor, when he bothered to come, kept no records. There were illnesses he had no names for, deformities medical textbooks didn't describe. He would leave the valley and drink himself silent in town, and when people asked what he'd seen, he'd only shake his head. But the woman in the photograph, her name was Alma, she looked almost normal. That's what made it worse, because normalcy in a place like that was its own kind of camouflage. Alma Whitaker was 16 when she became pregnant. In the valley, that wasn't unusual. Girls became mothers young, often before they understood what motherhood meant. But Alma's pregnancy was different. It carried a weight that even the other women noticed. She stopped coming to the communal well. She stopped attending the Sunday gatherings at the old Methodist chapel, where families would sing hymns in voices that all sounded vaguely related. She stayed inside her family's cabin, and when people saw her through the gaps in the wooden slats, she was always alone, sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing. Her father, Ezra Whittaker, was a man the valley feared, not because he was violent, though he was, but because he carried himself with the authority of someone who believed he owned things: land, animals, people. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered with hands like hammers and eyes that never blinked when he looked at you. He'd inherited the largest plot of tillable land in the valley, and that made him something close to royalty in a place where most families survived on nothing. Ezra's word was law. If he said a fence line ended at a certain tree, it ended there. If he said a debt was owed, it was paid. And if he said a question shouldn't be asked, no one asked it. When Alma's belly began to show, the women whispered, but only to each other. Only in voices so low they could pretend later they'd said nothing. The midwife, an old woman named Cora Fugate, was called to the Whittaker cabin 3 months before the baby was due. She later told her daughter, who finally told a researcher in 1998, that when she arrived, Alma was sitting in that same chair, and Ezra was standing behind her with one hand on her shoulder. He didn't move the entire time Cora examined the girl. He just stood there watching. And when Cora asked the question every midwife asks, "Who's the father?" Alma's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ezra's hand tightened on her shoulder, and Cora understood in that moment that some questions have answers too dangerous to speak aloud. The baby was born in January of 1937. A girl, perfectly formed, at least on the outside. But her eyes, those who saw her said her eyes looked old, like she'd been born already knowing something. For decades, the story of Alma and her unnamed child remained locked inside the valley. But in 2001, a genetic research team from the University of Kentucky began a study on inherited disorders in isolated Appalachian communities. They were looking for medical anomalies, rare genetic mutations, hereditary diseases, anything that could contribute to the scientific understanding of how isolation affects human biology. What they found instead was a genealogical nightmare, a nightmare that redefined the limits of human inbreeding. The researcher leading the project was Dr. Elizabeth Harrow, a clinical geneticist who had spent years studying closed populations. She'd worked with Amish communities, Icelandic villages, remote islands in the Pacific. But nothing prepared her for what the DNA samples from eastern Kentucky revealed. When she ran the genetic markers through her database, the software flagged an error. Harmful recessive genes, genes normally diluted across a diverse population, were being expressed in nearly every child. But more disturbing than the medical data was the genealogical map Dr. Harrow constructed. She traced birth records, census data, church logs, and oral histories going back to the 1840s. What emerged was a family tree so tangled it barely resembled a tree at all. It looked more like a web. Or a noose. Siblings married siblings. Fathers had children with daughters who then had children with their own sons. The same 12 surnames appeared over and over, looping back through the generations in combinations that made her physically ill to document. And then she found Alma. The 1937 birth certificate with the father's name left blank. Dr. Harrow requested a DNA sample from Alma's daughter, now in her 60s, living in a state facility for the cognitively impaired. When the results came back, Dr. Harrow sat alone in her lab for an hour, staring at the screen. The genetic markers didn't just suggest incest, they screamed it. The child's DNA showed a level of homozygosity consistent with a parent-child relationship. Alma hadn't just been abused. She'd been destroyed. And the man who destroyed her had already been in her bloodline for generations. Dr. Harrow did something researchers are trained never to do. She became personally involved. She began interviewing the few remaining people who had lived in or near the valley during the 1930s and 40s. Most were in their 80s or 90s. Most refused to talk, but a handful, perhaps sensing their own mortality, finally broke the silence their parents had kept. And every single one of them, when pressed, said the same thing. They knew. Everyone knew. Ezra Whittaker didn't just father Alma's child. He had fathered children with at least 3 of his own daughters over the course of 2 decades. The valley knew, the neighbors knew, the midwife knew, the traveling preacher who came twice a year knew, and they did nothing. Some claimed it wasn't their business. Others said the law didn't reach that far into the mountains. To expose him was to expose the rot that ran through all of them. One woman, 92 years old and dying of lung cancer, told Dr. Harrow something that made it into her research notes, but never into the published study. She said that when Alma's baby was born, Ezra held her up in front of the family and said, "This is what purity looks like." As if the child was a triumph, as if the genetic catastrophe he'd engineered across generations was something to be proud of. The old woman said she never forgot the way Alma looked in that moment. Not at the baby, but past it, at something no one else could see. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Ezra Whittaker died in 1953. His death certificate listed heart failure. He was buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist chapel, and his grave remains unmarked, not because he was forgotten, but because even in death, no one wanted to name him. Alma's daughter was named Sarah, though she would never learn to write it herself. She grew up in the same cabin where she was born, raised by a mother who rarely spoke, and a grandfather who watched her with the same possessive intensity he'd once watched Alma. By the time Sarah was 10, her developmental delays were undeniable. She had trouble forming sentences. Her motor skills were years behind other children. But worse than the cognitive damage was something the Valley people noticed but never discussed. She looked exactly like Ezra. The same heavy brow, the same deep-set eyes, the same crooked smile that never reached those eyes. She was his daughter and his granddaughter. And the genetic math of that impossibility was written across her face. When Dr. Harrow finally tracked Sarah down in 2003, she was 66 years old and living in a state-run facility in eastern Kentucky. The staff said she'd been there since 1971, transferred from another institution that had closed. Her medical records read like a catalogue of genetic disasters: severe intellectual disability, congenital heart defects that required 3 surgeries, skeletal abnormalities that left her barely 5 feet tall and unable to walk without assistance. But she was still alive, which made her an exception. Dr. Harrow's research revealed that of the 11 children born in the Valley between 1935 and 1945 who showed similar genetic profiles, only 2 survived past age 30. The others died from complications that had no clear medical explanations: organ failures in children, seizures that came without warning. One boy, born in 1939 to Ezra's youngest daughter, lived only 4 days. The local doctor, in a rare moment of documentation, wrote in his personal journal that the infant's brain had formed incorrectly. Parts were missing. Others were fused together. He wrote, "I have never seen anything like it outside of medical photographs from the worst genetic experiments. This is what happens when a bloodline becomes a closed loop. This is what happens when men play God in the dark." Sarah never married, never had children. When Dr. Harrow interviewed her using simplified language and visual aids, Sarah could only remember fragments of her childhood. She remembered her mother's silence. She remembered a man with big hands who smelled like tobacco and dirt. She remembered being told never to leave the Valley, that the outside world would hurt people like her. And she remembered, with a sudden clarity that startled even Dr. Harrow, the moment her mother died. Alma was 73. Sarah was holding her hand, and the last thing Alma said, after 60 years of near silence, was, "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." Dr. Elizabeth Harrow published her findings in 2006 in a paper titled "Genetic Consequences of Multigenerational Consanguinity in Isolated Populations." It was dry, clinical, stripped of names and specific locations to protect the living. But those who knew how to read between the lines understood what they were looking at: a documented case of one of the most severe instances of familial inbreeding in American history. The paper was cited in genetics journals. It was used in ethics courses at medical schools, but it never named Ezra Whittaker. It never named the Valley, and it never included the photograph of Alma holding her baby with that scratched-out face in the doorway behind her. The Valley itself is nearly gone now. Most of the families left in the 1960s and 70s when the government finally pushed roads through and the modern world came creeping in. The cabins collapsed. The chapel burned down in 1981. Cause unknown. The cemetery is overgrown, headstones swallowed by kudzu and wild roses. You can still find it if you know where to look, but nobody goes there anymore. The land was bought by a logging company in the 1990s, and they clear-cut most of it. What couldn't be sold was left to rot. But the genetic legacy didn't die with the valley. Sarah died in 2009. Her medical records, now part of a university research archive, show that her DNA is still being studied. Not because she was unique, but because she represents something scientists are only now beginning to fully understand: the breaking point of human genetics. How far can a bloodline fold in on itself before it simply stops? How many generations of incest does it take before the children born can no longer survive? Sarah was an answer to questions no ethical researcher would ever be allowed to ask. There are others still alive, scattered across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Descendants of the Valley families who carry those same genetic markers. Some know their history. Most don't. They just know they've had health problems no doctor can quite explain, developmental issues that run in the family. A sense that something in their blood is wrong, even if they can't name it. Dr. Harrow retired in 2018. She gave one final interview to a podcast about medical mysteries. And when asked what haunted her most about the Valley research, she paused for a long time. Then she said, "It wasn't the genetics. It was the silence." An entire community chose to protect one man's depravity for generations. They chose it, and the children paid the price in ways we are still discovering. The photograph of Alma still exists. It's in a private collection now, part of an archive of Appalachian history. The face in the doorway is still scratched out. No one has ever been able to identify who did it, or when, or why. But if you look closely at Alma's eyes in that picture, you can see something the camera captured that no one noticed at the time. She's not looking at the baby. She's looking directly at whoever's behind the camera. And her expression isn't sadness. It's accusation. As if she knew even then that people would see this image someday, that the silence would break, that the truth, no matter how long it was buried, would eventually claw its way back to the surface. Some bloodlines end in glory. Others end in silence. But this one ended in a genetic spiral that science is still trying to understand. A family tree that became a family knot, pulled so tight it strangled everyone inside it. The baby in the photograph never knew who her father was. But her DNA knew. And now so do you.